All right, I was gone for a couple days. Now I'm back. I was at an Airbnb for my fiance's birthday in Hope. We went to Manning Park. Pretty cool. But anyways, we're back now, and I'm going to talk about this record flood of investors behind Canada's housing crisis. So basically, the housing crisis is the fault of real estate investors. Canada's distorted housing market calls for more than cranes on the sky, given that investors now own 1 in 3 homes. There are other ways. This week, 3 of 4 Canadians declared that they have no confidence in Prime Minister Mark Carney's idea for solving the country's housing affordability crisis. Like most prime ministers and mayors, Carney is promising to build, baby, build to stimulate a record amount of housing construction, but Angus Reid Institute polling suggests the public is more than skeptical, perhaps in despair. While voters understandably get lost in the complexities of solving a house price catastrophe that sees average price at a ridiculous $1.2 million in Greater Vancouver and $1.1 million in Toronto, at least one veteran housing market analyst is making a clear and devastating case that Canada's dilemma is being significantly fanned by a wave of investors. John Passalis. John Passalis is a realtor in Toronto, I believe. Super smart guy. He does not share a lot of the opinions that I have, but I still watch every one of his videos because I like the way he breaks it down. And I will say, after watching his videos, he's kind of even pushed me a little bit further to the left. He explains the whole investor problem better than anybody else that I've heard on that left side, but I still disagree to a certain extent. Now, that being said, he's been doing this way longer than me and knows a lot more, but that's just where I stand. So he says politicians are abandoning people who want to live in their homes, and they're selling a generation of voters a fantasy that their worn ideas will lead to affordability. As long as politicians and housing economists insist that more supply is the solution, ignoring the financial dynamics driving demand from investors, we will continue to fall short. This is not a supply problem. It's a financialization problem, and solving it requires more than cranes on the sky. We're at a crossroads. For far too long, we've operated under the assumption that today's housing market is simply a more expensive version of the one our parents knew. It isn't. We are living through a paradigm shift, one in which homes are no longer primarily bought by local families, but by global investors. Housing has become a financial asset unbound from local incomes, and policy has yet to catch up. I'd agree with that. Last year, 30% of all homes in Canada were owned by investors, domestic and foreign, who buy properties they don't intend to occupy. That is a 50% jump in 10 years, so 50% more investors in the housing market than what was previously saw. In BC, an incredible half of all condos built in the past decade have been snapped up by investors. In Ontario, the proportion is 57%. Passalis says government policies are largely to blame. Agree? The frenzy of investment is forging 2 big problems. First, it's excluding younger generations from home ownership. And if you look at the real house price index for G7 countries, you'll see Canada all the way up here, and then this dark blue GBR. I don't know what that is. German? Is that going to stand for Germany somehow? I don't know. Second, it's creating a bizarre economy where investment money passively goes into hoarding homes rather than into business innovation and creating good jobs. Who are the investors? The answer may hit close to home for many readers. As opposed to end users who live in the dwellings they buy, Passalis says there's a tremendous range of investors, from a family purchasing a home near a university for their child, renting it out when it's not in use, to foreign investors buying condo units on speculation, and billion-dollar corporations acquiring low-rise houses to rent out in communities across Canada and the US. All fall under the broad category of investors. All fall under. Alas, most politicians show no interest in curtailing this giant cohort. That I disagree with, because they've just been throwing everything at investors here in BC. Everything but probably even including the kitchen sink. Every single policy, nearly every single housing policy that's come out in like the last 8 years has been screw investors. Like all the taxes, getting rid of Airbnb, all the tenancy board things, they hate investors. They've been doing everything to stop investors over the last 8 years, at least in BC, right? And then they banned foreign ownership. So I don't completely agree with that statement. One reason may be that many politicians are themselves investors. A study in 2023 found that almost 2 in 5 federal MPs are real estate financiers or landlords. We don't know if Carney owns investment property because he's not making his personal assets public, which he says are in a blind trust. Also, most politicians rely heavily on property developers for donations. Carney, for instance, took part in a Liberal Party fundraiser in Vancouver in February that included a who's who of BC property developers. Canada has built an economy where the best way to get rich isn't to invent, create, or build anything. It's to own homes and wait for prices to rise. I agree. And that's my whole thing, right? Like people make, like they demonize investors, and I'm not saying John Passalis is saying this, but like something that I've heard like on social media is that people literally say you are a shitty human being if you invest in real estate. Well, John just said right here, right? The best way is to own home and wait for prices to rise. So I always say, don't hate the player, hate the game. What conditions existed that made buying a house the best investment? What conditions existed within the economy that made people just buy a house instead of starting a business or whatever? I think we should be blaming that, not the player in the game. That means the usual free market belief that increasing supply to meet demand will eventually lower prices, not stand up in regard to houses. That's because homes are not like manufactured widgets such as vacuum cleaners. One big difference with widgets, says Passalis, is housing is a human necessity. The other is that widgets once bought go down in price, home tends to appreciate. Passalis describes how an affordable house tend to be one that costs 4 times a household annual income. Now in Toronto, the actual ratio is a grim 10 to 1. And in Vancouver, it's a destructive 12 to 1. So this is share of home purchases by type of buyer. And you have 2014 in the darker blue, and then today in the cyan or the lighter blue. And you can see now we're at 30% of all home purchases are investors, up from about 20%. And then you have a repeat home buyer, which is down from 30% to 25%. And then first-time home buyer used to be 50% of purchases. Now it looks like it's at about 43, 44, maybe about 45% of home purchases. Now, I want to point this out, right? Because this is January 2014, right? It's not like we only saw this in housing, right? I think the paradigm of the economy changed after 2008, after lower interest rates, after a bunch of stimulus. And I mean, if you look at the S&P, look at the way it was rising. And then right after the crash of 2008, look at what it's done after that, right? Pretty much the same thing housing did, right? So you have, during this time period, you have big government deficits, you have spending, you have stimulus, and all these things that cause basically fake growth and assets to appreciate like crazy. So, is it that investors all just decided it was time to be morally corrupt pieces of crap? Or did the conditions that existed in the economy post 2008 just made this the path of least resistance to just buy assets? Anyways, he says, as if that isn't bad enough, the industry's addiction to investors is causing the wrong kinds of homes to be built. That I would agree with. Investors tend to drive up condo prices beyond what they would be in a more balanced market because of their better access to capital than end users, says Passalis, noting that global access to wealth, credit, and leverage for some is almost limitless. Equally as important, investors have come to shape the projects that developers build, small units that offer the highest returns. Metro Vancouver and Toronto offer prime examples of this problem with their flood of tiny new apartments in towers, which can most easily be rented. It would be better if developers built more medium-rise, 3-bedroom dwellings suitable for young families. So I agree, we need more end-user product. I just don't know, like if you were to build a 3-bedroom condo in Willoughby right now that was actually end user, a big enough functional floor plan, it would cost maybe just as much, if not the same price as a 3-bedroom townhome, which isn't going to sell very well. And that's why most of these developments just do the bare minimum 3 bedrooms that the cities require them to do, because they're more expensive, the profit margins are lower, and nobody ends up buying them most of the time. But I do agree that we need more end user product for sure. Less of these smaller floor plans, which is most projects these days. It's 80% of the floor plans are too small, in my opinion. What can governments do to help so many who are frozen out of the market, especially almost 3 in 5 young and middle-aged adults who told a TD Bank survey they feel like buying a home is unattainable? Reducing record population growth is one thing, but the best way to fight investment mania is to make it less lucrative. I think part of the problem overall is that we as a country have already made everything else less lucrative. So the only thing that was left being lucrative was real estate investment, right? That was the only pathway out of the matrix, so to speak, right? One of Pasales' ideas, there are many in his clearly written 82-page report, is to hike taxes on the way investors profit from their dwellings, increasing value referred to as capital gains. Today, capital gains from real estate are taxed at a lower rate than income. Pasales says the solution is to remove this preferential tax treatment and tax any capital gains from single-family homes used as investment properties at the same rate as income. Such a tax reform would not be meant to be a punishment, but a realignment of incentives, says Pasales. Developers and most politicians will no doubt protest. Yet Pasales is dead on that Canada is going through a housing paradigm shift and revolutionary new solutions must be attempted. So basically, like what I'm gathering, like overall, basically says supply isn't the problem, right? We just need less investors, because if we had less investors, that would open up more of the overall housing stock that's already in existence for end users to be able to purchase that housing stock. A potential problem I see from this is now we're getting less resale housing built, right? Because the way we fund resale housing to purchase in the future is with investors, right? Investors are a very large portion of the buyer of pre-sale purchases. So if we don't have those, we get less housing being built, right? But maybe what he's saying is like, hey, maybe we do have less resale supply coming online, but maybe we don't even need it. Maybe we just need to unlock more of the supply that's already existing. And yes, we will build less resale supply, but maybe more developers will kind of go the rental route, because if you're not actually going to sell that building and you're just going to hold on to it as, a long-term rental asset, then you don't have to pay the capital gains on it right now. You might pay the capital gains on it 15, 20 years from now, right? So less investors overall unlocks more supply. And then in the future, yes, we're building less supply, but we won't need as much of it because more of the overall supply is already unlocked. And the supply that we do build will be more catered towards end users. It can work, right? I see what he's saying and it makes sense to me. The problem that I see is like, it's always a game of whack-a-mole, right? It's like, raise taxes on investors, then some other problem comes up. And, the way things are right now is like there really are no investors in the market as we currently speak, right? I think the problem for the last 20 years, when you compare it to any time frame before that, was low interest rates. Well, now the interest rates aren't low anymore. So you're seeing way less investors in the market. Like investors are the reason why home prices went up. On the flip side of that, they're also the reason why home prices are going down right now, right? Because you had a whole bunch of investors pile into the market in 21, 22. They helped get all this supply built. All that supply is coming to market now in 2025, 2026 at a time when there's record low demand. And that is pushing down prices. It's also pushing down rents. And then you have investors that have already owned property for 5, 10 years that are also liquidating their properties because the rental numbers don't make sense on them anymore with rents falling and interest rates being higher. So, I tend to lean towards we don't need to add an additional tax on investment. As long as rates were to stay around here, you're probably going to have way less investors anyways. And their interest rates probably should have been higher right from the start at, the beginning of the turn of 2010 or whatever, and we would have had way less investing in speculation over the last 15 years. But I am just a Fraser Valley realtor and I have no idea what I'm talking about. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. If you want to chat with me about buying or selling in the Fraser Valley, you can book a call using the link below. Otherwise, I'm that Agent Kelly. I'm making moves to move you. Peace.